Sir Michael Lyons, Vice Chair of the Lunar Society, introduces the evening and acts as question master, with the audience invited to quiz the panel. The event was kindly sponsored by Taylor Grange Developments. We also give thanks to the Chamberlain Highbury Trust for hosting the discussion.
Well, can I extend to all of you a very warm welcome here on behalf of the Lunar Society and also our host, the Chamberlain Highbury Trust. The Trust was established in 2016 to preserve and restore both this fine building but also the grounds and to try and find a permanent, sustainable future for them. So we're very pleased that they've provided the space for this event tonight, and there's Sparks, their chair, here, and other colleagues. Good. The Lunar Society, established more than 20 years ago to promote debate and action for the common good. So, and it draws its inspiration, as I'm sure you know, from 18th century meetings of prominent people whose names are really strongly associated with the beginnings of industrialization in this country and the English Enlightenment. So, and of course, they used to meet, there are no streetlights then, they used to meet on the night of the full moon, and that's why they became known as the Lunar Men. I think they weren't entirely full moon, but you know how these things go, so you only remember the men who did anything. But so I'd just to take this opportunity also, before I ramble on about the Lunar Society too much, although if you're not a member, you won't be allowed to leave until you've signed up. But you'd be very welcome to join us. But I'd like to also thank our sponsors tonight, the Taylor Grange Group, who are making their own contribution to the current reshaping of the city, but have, through their sponsorship, enabled us to both put on some refreshments, which I hope you've enjoyed, but also to have a decent PA system. And these events work so much better when you can hear exactly what everybody's saying. Now, I think it's true to say that it's difficult to imagine a better venue for this debate about the importance of place and how Birmingham measures up as a place to live and work in than this building. It was, of course, the home of Joseph Chamberlain. It's probably the best example of civic leadership in the Victorian era, reshaped the city centre and left us with some very fine, not only fine buildings, but also actually the beginnings of a city which had very real confidence in its abilities. But not only that, the Highbury Hall also lent its name in the 80s to a very important initiative, the Highbury Initiative, which drew urban planners both from this country and abroad to Birmingham to talk about how could we make this city a better city for the people who live in it, and particularly for its pedestrians, and to move away from the dominance of the car. Now, those are still live issues, but that Highbury Initiative led directly to the doing away with, many of you are too young to remember this, the underpasses of Birmingham, which were rather a grim legacy. So, but tonight we're going to talk about place, the importance of place, and I think it's important to say that when we talk about place, what is it that we mean? Well, it isn't just geography. There's this place here, or there's this place over there. It's much more about what distinguishes one place from another, the issues of different histories, different cultures, different populations, different economic roles, and how they lead to a place being either more or less attractive to people to either live in that place, to visit it, or to invest in it. That's really the subject matter for us to discuss tonight. And I hope we won't just talk, well, I know we won't, because we've handpicked the panel to make sure we don't, just about buildings and infrastructure and roads, all of those very important, nor even the software of the city, good education, good social services, but also to get into the more nebulous area, which we might call the shareware of the city, how we work together, issues of inclusivity, and how we really in this city look after each other. So we hope to get onto some of those subjects. Now, onto business, really. We call this a question time like event, because we don't want to get sued by the BBC if they're using their brand. But it follows the same format. We've got a great panel of people, all of whom are currently involved in one way or another in the shaping of Birmingham, in that very broadest sense. And I'm going to start from my right. Waheed Nazir is the City Council's Corporate Director for Economy and has played a crucial leadership role in what I think we might agree is one of the most intense periods of investment and regeneration in Birmingham. Sitting beside me is Deborah Cadman, OBE, Chief Executive of the West Midlands Combined Authority. She works directly to the Metro Mayor, Andy Street, across the range of his responsibilities for transport, strategic planning, and leadership in housing. She brings a rich experience of leading public authorities, not only in the West Midlands, but in very different parts of the country. So some learning that she might share with us about how Birmingham measures up to places which are very different from this system. On my left, Immy Kaur, entrepreneur, co-founder of the Impact Hub Birmingham, coordinator of Birmingham TED Talks, and a highly regarded voice on community relations and inclusion. Next to Immy is Alan Chatham, who I'm particularly pleased to come to join us today. I hope to seduce him into telling you the story at some point of the mailbox, which is absolutely a barnstorming story about one man's vision and an opportunity which he grabbed and took. So he's Chief Executive of Chatham Billingham Investments, and has been personally responsible for some of the landmark developments in the city, including the mailbox. And then our fifth panel member, over on the right, and we were discussing, Lisa and I earlier on, why I'm describing her as distinguished. She says it's just because she's past a certain birthday. I don't think that's entirely fair. A distinguished member of the City Council, community activist, and a member of the Chamberlain Highbury Trust. So all of you are very welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. And again, thank you for being with us. So I'm going to start off by asking each member of the panel to just share with us a couple of sentences on their view about, is it helpful to think about place when you're trying to improve quality of life in this city? What does it add to the debate? Waheed.
I think it's fundamental. When you look at trying to create a quality of place, you're fundamentally doing that for the people who live in there or work in there. So it has to be at the heart of actually when you recreate, or actually whether that's new development or refurbish, it's actually got to be at the heart of it.
Thank you very much. Brief as I asked you to be, and that's excellent. So, Lisa, what about you?
Okay. I absolutely think place is fundamental to the developing of all good policy. And the reason I believe place is important because people shape space to make place. And actually, if you focus on place, you're in by default focusing on the people who make those places. And in focusing on the people, you focus on the assets. And the Birmingham people are the greatest assets of our city.
Immy.
So I think that place is really, really important. I think right from the soil of a place and the history to understand how it got to where it is, which way money flowed, how people came into the city, how they left, why we find ourselves where we are today is really important in how you go forward and understand the populations, the demographics, the dreams, the hidden traumas, the more obvious ones, and how you can design for more inclusive futures when you can understand that. But I also think that there's something that's really, really important about pride of place. And I don't mean that in a nationalistic kind of what we're currently in, but what it means to be part of a street, a neighbourhood, a community. And that plays out in so many different ways, from how clean the street is to how people engage in the local school, all those small micro actions that grow to become a bustling, thriving place. So I think place is very important, as long as it doesn't become where we're currently at, where it's kind of, let's just think about place over everything else. So in interdependence, I think thinking about place is really important.
Thank you. Deborah.
I would agree with all my fellow members of the panel here. place is really important for me in the role that I've got at the moment in the West Midlands Combined Authority. Our vision is to create a place where people are healthier, happier, better connected and more prosperous. And you can only do that within the context of heritage, culture, geography, politics, and more importantly, that heartbeat of diversity that we have across the region. But I would actually pose a question back to you, actually. What are the risks of not creating a place that works for us, both in the city and across the region?
Thank you. Alan?
Well, I'm obviously going to agree that place is vitally important. I think I look at it from the perspective of when we all walk around cities, we either enjoy them or we don't. And the experience of moving through them in our memory defines them. And I think if for a city to have the respect that it craves, it's got to get that right. The issue for me with space is the gap between the buildings that's filled with people and activity and different types of activity depending on the type of spaces. But it doesn't have an owner. The buildings have owners, but the spaces in between fall into lots of different ownerships. And because there's not a strategic owner, it's very difficult to make them everything we would like them to be.
Thank you all. Now that all sounds remarkably as if you're all going to agree with each other all evening. I'm confident that's not it. But it's a nice warm start to the... Now, just to remind you, we are taking questions from you. I've already got a number here. Don't feel that you have to ask a question, but if you feel you want to, then either fill in a form or towards the end of the session, if I might come in and look for any questions that people have been inspired to ask. Just to reassure you, I come armed with lots, so there isn't going to be a silence if you all, if you don't have one. I'm going to take our first question from somebody who all of us know, I think, is a really sort of long-standing voice on place in Birmingham. That's Joe Holyoake from the Victorian Society. Joe, are you happy for me to read out your question? So you're asking, making successful places depends on a degree of permanence. In Birmingham, everything is temporary. How can these two things be reconciled? So, who's going to come to this? I think as somebody who has moved a few permanences in your time, you want to have a go at that?
Is everything in Birmingham temporary? I think I know what Joe's getting at. But in my view, if that's a question that's based around that all the buildings might disappear, I think coming back to what is going to be a central theme for me is that the spaces can also define the buildings as well as the buildings define the spaces. So when I very first came to Birmingham, Terry Farrell was doing the master plan on Brindley Place. He drew a slide of the ICC, the NIA as it was then, the Hyatt Hotel, the Novotel on Broad Street, and he says all these things that come out of the City Council's work, really great, but they're not joining up. And what we tried to do with Brindley Place, he drew a heart around all those things, and Brindley Place tried to be the connector. So it opened up the canal side to face the ICC. It created a bit of a gateway to Broad Street, but it also allowed permeability from all of the old streets in the area. Around the Sea Life Centre, it opened up and gave you a view of that lovely roundabout in the middle of the canal. It became what he called urban glue. And once you have good defined spaces, then the buildings around them can be redeveloped over time. And you can see this if you go to Italy. And the spaces are 1,000 years old and more. And so I think it's about getting the spaces right all the time will help you get better buildings, not the other way around.
Lisa, you've it must be challenging this perception with your work at the Highbury Trust, but don't feel limited to the trust work.
I think there is one of the challenges for Birmingham is in many ways we are retrofitting an 18th and 19th century city to 21st century need. And we have a horrible habit, potentially as Joe's referencing, of actually ignoring our valued Victorian assets. I was one of those who saw the master plan for Moore Street Station and was absolutely horrified to have seen something that has been very symbolic and is actually a very beautiful gateway to our city that has a tourist attraction that is actually part of the DNA of our city just being ripped up. And we have to get better at appreciating the jewels in our crown. This building is very much its part. It's iconic. As you said, I work for the council. I'm a councillor. I can remember the Highbury initiatives. I was one of those kids who got on a coach at 18 and swore I'd never come back to this city. And, it was actually Brindley Place. It was the change to our city centre that actually made me want to bring my children up and stay here. What I would say is times have moved on. And what we have to do is realise those approaches were needed. They were needed at a time when the city was facing bankruptcy. But what we now need to do is connect those communities. We left communities behind. We didn't address the inequalities. And I think what is actually really great about a building like this is that it actually symbolises and was at the heart of what civic government should be and was under the auspices of Chamberlain. We have to find a 21st century model. And I don't believe at the moment we do have a 21st century model that is effectively shaping and making our cities for the benefit of our communities. We can aspire to it, but we are failing our communities at this point in time. And I very much hope through Highbury and Highbury coming back into its former glory, we can be at the core of shaping learning and helping younger people help us and challenge us to that new future.
Deborah, you look across the whole West Midlands and, as we said earlier on, have experience elsewhere in the country. Are there things that Birmingham could learn better?
I think there's a real balance to be struck between having real anchors in places, whether that's buildings or communities or culture. But then the opposite side of the coin is that the places need to reflect the communities and the time that it exists in. And I say this because previous role, I was chief exec of St Edmundsbury Borough Council, which had Bury St Edmunds at its heart. And it was a place where people wanted to kind of wrap it up in Aspie because they didn't want any change. But the town was failing and dying because we didn't have that vibrancy of retail and culture and arts. We had a cathedral, it still has a cathedral, which is quite fantastic, but it just didn't change and evolve with what people were expecting from their place at the time. And it was really, really difficult. But we had to identify real anchors. We had to create a new place that had its anchor in that medieval grid and that medieval history and culture and heritage. And it took a lot of time, but we did it with the people, for the people. And now, if any of you know Bury St Edmunds, it is one of the most vibrant towns in the east of England. But we had to do it in a very thoughtful place. So we had to encourage agility and change, but make sure there were real anchors that people could appreciate. And I think it's that balance that you have to strike.
Immy, can you come in on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with Lisa around new models. I think, look, there's a reason why we're sort of also systemically stuck in this with short-term election cycles and the ability to not have accounting for the long-term liabilities of some of the decisions we make, right? So I do think there's some deep innovation in the ability to structurally think for the long term. But there's so many incredible examples about in this city of people grabbing hold of an opportunity and using their vision or their stubbornness to make sure it happens. If you read the story of Cannon Hill Park, like, the way it's told back is that there was this lady who never got married, and then she had no husband who took her wealth, so then it just went to the city. But actually, if you read really deeply, and I'm sorry I've forgotten the name, somebody in here will know her name, yeah. But you read about this story where she actually wanted to marry this man, and her father wouldn't let her, so she decided, right, well, if I can't marry him, I'm never going to marry anyone. And to the end of her days, she stayed single so she could hold on to her wealth, and then she gave that away in a really long-term way to the city. And something like Cannon Hill Park is in our blood. We make the most of it. We go through it. We complain about it. People get mugged in it. We run in it. People do yoga in it. There's runs in there. There's 1,000 people every Saturday morning. The Mac is sometimes the toilets for it. Other times it's an incredible art centre. It does a lot of things that we just take for granted. But there was some real stubbornness and resilience from somebody. I mean, I don't know the full context, but I know this a little bit. And so I think, look, right now, I do think there is also the need for that, because whilst I believe in very well-funded, generous public services and libraries as a bedrock of a democracy, I can't see where this is coming from. I don't know what's going to happen in government. I'm not sure what's going to happen next. Everybody is struggling, and we're having to find money from all over the place, including foreign investors and many other things. So within that space, I think it's really, really important for Birmingham to invest, believe, and uplift those who are trying to change models, trying to look at what a more hybrid, civic, commercial model could look like. How can we make our buildings and our places work better? How can we be more experimental? How can some of what we need be like this, long legacy, but other things be much more agile and for what's needed in a community at a time, and then can be repurposed after another period of time when somebody else moves in. But I think underpinning that, what I would like to see a little bit more of is we're one of the cities in the country that doesn't have a single community land trust at the moment, and there's a lot of things that we need to do where we can have a hybrid of commercial, big money, foreign money, but we can also understand from the examples of London and other first capital cities that you need to have that mix of land that is owned by the community, that people have a real pride and a reason to stick around and invest in. And also, given that the long history of Birmingham, if you go back to probably the darker, more controversial times of the Chamberlain legacy, things like land and assets and wealth were stripped away from certain communities, which has led to a long legacy of challenge. And I think that if you really want to value the demographic of this city and say, we think it's one of the biggest assets, we can start to be really creative with some of what we do with some of the land, and really trust that there is a creativity and a really nice radicalism that exists in our citizens, and we can be part of that story. And it doesn't just have to be a story of big money. It can be a story that is broader than that. So a few different things. I think systemic, but I also think we need to be really intentional about what we mean about valuing the assets and the citizens of this place.
Thank you. Waheed, probably more than any other member of the panel, this is your day job, isn't it? Trying to get the balance between bringing new investment and change, but also trying to make the most of existing assets. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. I suppose you can define it as either the city's temporary or the city's evolving, as many cities across the UK and across the world have to continue to change. I think there is some fixed assets, which actually the issue is about how do you make the most of them. If you think of our canal network, if you think of some of the opportunities that we have, some of our great buildings, it's actually how do you get the balance of retaining some of our history where we came from, so also how you embrace some of the change and meeting that growth. And if I think of, say, somewhere like Birmingham Smithfield, where we had the wholesale markets on there, I can tell you I'm quite proud of the fact that we've moved the markets and actually are going to go back and go back to 1166 and start to celebrate the foundation of Birmingham back where the moat was. And that redevelopment goes back and reflects on the history of where the city started as part of its next chapter. And I don't think we should be shy about actually having the next chapter. What we should be doing is recognising the history of where we came from and actually celebrating that. Because I think part of the challenge as we're evolving is some people don't understand the history, and some people don't understand the pride that this was one of the greatest cities. When you think about going back to where you started, Chamberlain and the Industrial Revolution, we were such a dynamic city, and actually I think we lost our way over time. And I think it's going back to respect some of that history, but making sure you get that balance right. And I have to say to you, it's not an easy task. It's probably easier to sit there and tell me where I've got it wrong than actually when you've made it right. But it is a challenge of getting that balance right, but respecting the history of the city. And that respect also is about continuing to inspire that next generation.
Thank you. The next question comes from Carol Keenahan, who tells me she's retired from the University of Birmingham. And in fact, she's got a number of questions, but the one that seems to me the most interesting is she suggests that Birmingham as a brand is very low. Its brand value is very low. And she puts that down to poor leadership. Lisa, just to say, I'm not bringing you in as the voice of the City Council, but you might want the chance to come back on.
Okay. I think this city and this region is challenged by its leadership. Leadership is a collaborative practice. It needs to be across sectors. It needs to be a partnership. And I think as somebody who's worked in the city, worked from outside the city, Birmingham is a tough place, a very tough place to engage with, connect to. I think at times what we have done is we've had some wondrous examples. We've had pockets of absolute brilliance, but it really picks up on Waheed's point that we haven't then learned from those and built on the legacy of the brilliance. We almost reject what is, each time we keep on creating a new chapter instead of actually following the pathway. Really, really great world cities follow those pathways and keep on a continued learning curve. And I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges that Birmingham's leaders have collectively got. They actually have to learn from where we have come from to know where we're going to. And very much, actually, what we have to collectively do is own some of the mistakes that maybe we've made, because actually by owning those, we can truly start to shape a much better future, because austerity has been awful for this city. It has ripped apart the social fabric. We have 450,000 people who are living in poverty in this city. That is huge. You cannot underestimate what austerity has done to those communities. And what we actually have to do every time, every action as public leaders, so I'm talking now as a council, we have to think, how are we going to benefit those communities? What are we doing to make a difference to those citizens? And I think for me, some of our leadership at times, we've lost that touch. We've lost actually the understanding on how we reconnect to those communities. And for many of our communities, heat or eat is the daily dilemma. And quite frankly, how successful the Commonwealth Games is going to be is not really on their agenda.
Waheed, you're trying to bring the infrastructure together for those Commonwealth Games. How do you
Career
see it?
challenging moment, love.
Yeah. Well, I make no comment on the leadership. I think Lisa has said that. So I clearly think we have great leadership. If Ian's listening to this, I absolutely think we do. I think one of the challenges in the city, and I can say this because I spent a lot of time in other UK cities, is we do hammer ourselves more than actually we do outside. So when I go and we speak to investors and we talk about the uniqueness of the city, people are amazed about when they actually learn about the history of the city, learn about what we achieve. I don't think there's probably a comment about, and I think Lisa's covered that, about the collective leadership of how we present ourselves, but I think we beat ourselves up more about this very issue, and I think it's quite sad really, because I've been 10 years as a chief officer in Birmingham, and every year I get the same message about people feeling that we haven't got the message out, the confidence. And actually there's other cities who have got similar problems and probably fight more, but actually have a clear narrative, and they give an image of being a lot more coherent, and therefore that gives a perception of greater leadership, and that really undermines our ability to bring investment in. And we've got some great stories and some great legacies that come out of the city, but we keep hitting ourselves over the head. And that's how it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we're just constantly saying how poor our leadership is. And I can tell you, particularly up north, they fight more than we do here, but actually do not let you know that they fight that much.
Immy, can I bring you in? I mean, I think the gist of what you were saying earlier on is about there being leadership at lots of levels that you need to activate. In fact, I think Ralph Nader said, didn't he, that what we need is not followers, but lots of leadership that spawns many more leaders. Is that true?
Yeah. So just to point on what we just talked about, I think I agree with many of the points, and I also want to say that I grew up coming back to the city and really believing in it at a time where it was starting to change a little bit. And I can't tell you what it's like to be part of that demographic that was on the front of all of the, promo of the city, 40% under 25, our young people are our future, and really thinking, wow, this is going to be a place that is really for me to make our dreams happen. And then to sort of watch, yes, the pockets of brilliance and moments where we really felt like there was a collective light and we were going in a direction that you could really believe in. But then being that young person who was trying to be doing stuff in the city and watching politics play out over every obvious decision, and decisions that you, as a young person, you think, well, why didn't we go for that? Because that was really important. And you find out there was some infighting and someone did a deal, and you start to discover the city and its leadership through all of this, the bits that were in between the pockets of brilliance. And I think that it's really important to share the kind of impact that that's had on this young demographic, where trust and belief in leadership is in many ways at an all-time low, right? It really is, and it's a bit of a joke, and I agree that it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when the Birmingham City Council gets brought up amongst certain demographics, everyone's just like, oh, you know, and that's not great. But having said that, what that golf or space did was allow lots of people to sort of rise up, right? So there's lots of things that we have been really, really good at, and lots of communities that have put on things like even, you know, our TEDx, which is a global platform. It won awards for being one of the best in the world because it was radical and it pushed boundaries. And to be honest, most of the city was too busy fighting with each other to worry about what people like us were doing. So we just carried on. And so I think that yes, I mean, I think the word leadership is really important and loaded and needed right now because of the big gaps that we can feel at a national, particularly a national level. And so you do need leaders to rise up. But I also think that my experience of working with now thousands of citizens over the last 10 years is that this sort of leadership, energy, excitement, potential to be part of making places exists in every corner of this city. Like, there is no lack of incredible citizens and leadership. It's just about how much we value a certain type of organising and leadership, and I think we need to just go back into that sort of neighbourhood level and get people to really believe that what they can do on their street, in their neighbourhood, in their corner of the city, because it won't take much to really unearth so much of the assets that I've been really lucky to see over the years. So yeah.
Thank you. Deborah, the combined authority, what does it complicate things, or does it bring the chance of building new combined leadership?
I think devolution gives us an opportunity, and we are at a bit of a moment here where we are able to shape both leadership and what we do in a completely different way. And there's a bit of me in response to this assertion that Birmingham has a brand that's of low value. There's a bit of me that wants to say, just stop this, just stop it. And I deal quite often with global investors, with people from across the country, and let me tell you, the brand of Birmingham is not low. And we need to stop making this assumption that Birmingham and the West Midlands is a rubbish place. I've just signed off an industrial strategy for the West Midlands. And that contains evidence of sectors that are of not just of regional importance and not just national importance, but global importance as well. So our advanced manufacturing base, our autonomous vehicle R&D, diagnostic life sciences, these are sectors that have an international and global reach, and we should be really proud of that. I agree with Immy that we're not as focused as we need to be on making sure that the residents of this region are in a position where they can fully benefit from and contribute to the economic growth that we are seeing and will continue to see, I think. So there's a bit of me that gets really cross when I hear people say that you know, Birmingham and the region is rubbish or of low value. That is not the case. And I think internally we need to start believing that we are a region of significance and impact. And I had a meeting with some businesses a few weeks ago, and they were talking about their contribution to the Commonwealth Games, and they were saying, oh, it's terrible, we're only local businesses. And I went, no, you are businesses who happen to be operating in a locality. You know, you've got to turn it round and see the role that you play in defining this space and contributing to this economic growth. So there is a bit of our psyche that I think we need to kind of switch.
Thank you. Alan, you are now at a stage where you can invest anywhere. Is this still attractive to you? What's your the city?
Yeah, I think it is still attractive. But I'd like to say a little bit about brand.
Yep.
Before I did, Michael, I thought it'd be really interesting to hear your view on leadership and how you not the past, not what you see now, not critical of people, but is there a new or better way of leading a city like this?
Oh my goodness, I'm really on thin ice here, more than any of you.
Borrow my skates.
I think, let me just pick up a couple of the comments which have been, so as not to dodge the bullet, as it were, which is Lisa's comment about the importance of building coalitions. Actually, after I worked here in Birmingham, I went off to do this review of the role and functions of local government. And one of the things that I said in that was that actually we need bolder local government in this country, stronger leadership. And I introduced the term of place shaping, stewardship of a place across all of the dimensions, so not just preoccupied with the council services. Let's take an example, for instance. For much of recent history, not current history, for much of recent history, Birmingham City Council was preoccupied with the management of its housing, as opposed to making sure that actually there were all sorts of housing choices for all its population. Now that, I think, is much more mainstream now. And so stewardship of place is about not just being preoccupied with council services, but looking beyond that to
I think that's my question, actually.
Go on, you let me off now.
Can we change seats? No, our question really is that how do you create a network below the government, central government, local government level that does connect into where's the bit that does that? That's what I don't understand.
Well, I think that could come back to some of the things you were saying, Shimi, and as we're saying about valuing leadership where you see it in practice and allowing it to flourish and not feeling that you have to control everything. I think that's, for a very large muscular council like Birmingham, it can sometimes leave the impression that actually, if it isn't doing it, nobody else is, which is not true.
Maybe I misunderstood what Amy was saying, but I thought she was saying that there wasn't support, and I was looking at a network. I was just trying to understand if there's a space there between the central government, local government, and local communities, and not to fill it with control, but to fill it with support. And I don't know in any way how to do that.
Well, I was just going to say, just to clarify on my point, yeah, there is, I mean, we could go into a whole stack of support services that help things, but I think actually at the stage that we're at right now, right this second, we're not sure where that's going to come from. And so there is actually pockets of great organising happening, and we just, in many ways need to not move out the way, but just ensure that we help that to grow and flourish and know that we are actually all on the same team, even though we're coming at it from very different examples, and that the scale of different things might look, not quite as impressive as some of the massive things coming into the city. So I think that there's some of this where it can feel very hard to get things done here, and it feels like you have to have an incredible amount of resilience to get through it. And I just don't want that to be the first barrier before you're actually even getting on with some of that. But yeah, I think there is a massive role for how you enable all of that. But
Bring Lisa in, then I'll come back to you.
I think, and again, I think it's partly about the council and others being much better at letting go and a willingness to share ideas and talents. An example I could give where I've worked with Immy, I've worked with UK Green Builder Council here, was we have one of the most appalling estates in Europe, Druids Heath Estate, massive poverty, appalling tower blocks, large frame tower blocks that should have been down, but some fantastic green space connected to the canals on the edge of the city, real potential. Some of the best performing primary schools, failed academy, went bust. We had an opportunity to look at regeneration in the round. Instead, a really sterile housing-led development has been put forward by the council. And it runs contrary to what the residents' ambition was, to what we bought in Glen Howes. We had a whole range of potential people looked at that estate, and imagination was run wild with the residents, and a narrative was formed that was positive. And what we're not good at, because we have processes and we are up against it, when Waheed and I were sort of much younger, working in sort of regeneration, there was hundreds. There's 1, 2 or 3 people. There's very few people who discuss. Those opportunities then get lost into the playing safe. And I think one of the issues is that we've got to start to take some risk, and we've got to take risks and build those coalitions and put faith in the communities and their ability to actually know what they want, not us with this top-down, local authority is going to actually stick so many houses on your area because we know best.
Can I just say one quick comment as well? When we talk about risk, I think one of the most important things that we need to keep asking ourselves is, what is the risk of not doing this?
Absolutely.
Like looking 5, 10 years down the line and say, what is the risk of constantly having residents or citizens of this place feeling like they weren't listened to, they weren't part of this? What is the risk of over-centralising, of over-controlling for everybody? And I don't just mean that as a shouting at Birmingham City Council, I know they really are up against it, but what is the risk of not? And I just think when we talk about risk, we need to really keep reframing those questions, because there's many other cities that we can look at quite quickly as to what happens when you don't have that mixed, and when I say diverse, I mean in lots of different ways, types of things happening. There is a big risk of what happens of not investing in this future. So I think we've got to just make sure we constantly reframe risk.
Deborah, you coming.
So I left Birmingham in 1996, and at that time we were developing city pride. And Les and Sandy were part of that as well. You can probably remember that. And Michael, I know that you were the instigator of that. So why are we now here, 22 years later, still talking about the lack of pride and the lack of brand in this city? And I pose, and it's a rhetorical question, but we need to ask ourselves, what's happened over the last 22 years when we are still struggling to find that sense of pride in this city?
Perhaps we should go back to the question on this. And Carol, are you going to be bold enough to tell us? What do you think? Yeah, what do you think of what you've heard from the panel on this? Okay, let's come back to give Waheed a chance. Not that he wants, not that I want to put all this on his shoulders, but I think you do the city a massive injustice in terms of the amount of. In fact, you might argue this is a city which has spent too much time with successive plans. But what's going on around Paradise Sector is very ambitious, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, clearly we won't agree on your summary. I think we set out a very clear plan called the Big City Plan in 2010, which talked about actually building on the hybrid initiative, about further breaking down the concrete collar, further continuing to improve pedestrian connectivity. And my biggest challenge since I've taken over is we built this city for the car, and actually I feel like I spend most of my time trying to undo the mistakes we did in the past, and actually having a clean slate to start to shape the city. Paradise was trying to improve that connectivity back from the city core and improve that connectivity back into West Side, into Brindley Place, because actually it's an interesting observation you make, but actually we've got Brindley Place and it's unfinished, and then you had Paradise, and then you had all of these barriers. You could see no permeability when you come out of New Street Station all the way through up to Paradise. You thought it finished. So actually much of the decisions around Paradise, much of the decisions around trying to reinvest back into Centenary Square and actually make it a single square that the buildings come edge to edge, as you would find in most European cities, was part of the strategy. You may disagree on the design of the buildings and the heights and etc., but I think there has been a clear plan about improving those pedestrian routes. What I find quite frustrating though is these things take an incredibly long time. So we're not going to see all the benefits today. I mean, Paradise is still going to take, Brindley Place took, I think, a lifetime. And we've just finished the last building. I mean, these things will take incredibly long time for you to see the full benefit of that permeability and that flow through the city. We still haven't finished, but I don't think the point we'll ever finish as a city. We'll have to keep that evolving.
I think that's right. Anyway, I'm going to move us on to another question. Jez Collins from Birmingham Music Archive asks us, what does the panel feel culture plays in placemaking and altering perceptions of Birmingham? So it really follows quite naturally, I think. Come on, Deborah, you have the first crack.
I think it's really important and vitally important. So when I talk about developing places, be that building houses, extending the metro, a connected public transport system, skilling our people, I always talk about what does this mean for the heartbeat of our communities, and what does it mean for, you know, feeding people's soul, just as much as we talk about enabling them to achieve prosperous lives. And I think if we can't feed people's souls through culture and enable them to identify and find that anchor in their communities, then there's a bit of me that thinks we've kind of failed, really. So I think culture has a massive role to play in regeneration and economic development, not just through tourism, but bringing a new sense of adventure and pride, actually, to a place. So I believe culture has a massive part to play in both creating a place but also driving growth as well.
Thank you. Oh, what's your take on this?
Not sure. In the sense, I don't really know how to express it. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, yeah, culture is really important. I think I'm not equipped to talk about the local communities and the links and all that, so I'm going to stick to placemaking and kind of how I see it. And the best places have this mix of people know what they are, they know how they use them. There are small places with people sitting around, they have coffee there, they know when the sun's in that place. There are people in big places when the circus comes to town, and that's that. And a city needs a mix of these places, and the culture of each of them is different, and the identity of each of them is different. What's important is the analysis that goes into something like that evolving. And sometimes they evolve without analysis. It's just people make them. But if you are making them, then of course how it will be used is vital, and the way it will be used and what people enjoy it is all vitally important. But it all relates also to traffic and vibrancy and everything else that comes with it. So I'm a doer, so I'm not really very good at talking about, you know, generalist things. I always have to come back in my head to, so how would I do it? And I think that's my take on it, is you have to look around, you have to decide who is there, how can you use it, what can it be, how can it be adapted, and how can you make it happen?
Immy?
I agree with Deborah on most of that, so I'm not gonna deal with the sort of big. I sit on the board of the Hippodrome, and I see the role it plays in bringing people into the city and their first encounter, and children's first encounter of theatre, and the possibility that the arts creates. I think there's a long way to go to make places like the Hippodrome feel like they are something for everybody in this city, and I think it's on that journey. What I'm interested in is, I think, the role of artists within building culture. I think artists have a very particular ability to help people to dream and imagine the future and what that can look like. And I think right now it's a really radical act to have hope, to really dream and imagine what new futures could look like and where we can work towards. And I'm very, very lucky to be surrounded by a lot of artists every day and invest in them in my team. And I think I'd say over the last 4 or 5 years, what I've really seen is those small DIY cultures in every corner of the city that are saying, no, you know what, we get up tomorrow and we fight again, and this is what it looks like. And that can play out in many, many different ways, all the way up to how the urban, how cities are built. There's an incredible artist who did a piece of work called Cities Alive in collaboration actually with Arup, and designed a vision for what child-friendly cities could look like, and it was just incredible. And it's just there, you know, with 50 recommendations of what every city can start with. Obviously, you know, you still need to get up to the decision makers to get that stuff to happen, but I think that it's so important to invest in those small pockets of incredible artists in this city, in the region, who are taking a DIY approach, because they are able to imagine futures that the general population at the moment is struggling to grapple what the future could look like and to really believe and dream about it. So I think artists have a really crucial role, especially in darker times. And I know a lot of people keep saying to me, it's not that bad in the arc of history, you know, we've had worse times, but you have to go to what people are feeling on the street and how polarised and divided, and in some ways many demographics feel quite unsafe, unsure, unsettled. And I think artists just have an incredible role in helping us to see beyond that. So I think they are really important in the DNA of a place and the DNA of how we move forward in that democracy of dreams, which I think really needs to happen. We need to learn how to dream and believe and create and imagine again, and I think artists and culture is at the forefront of that.
Waheed, we seem to be coming back to this tension again between big scale and small scale, the individual and almost the corporate, really. The 90s initiative was very much led by the role of the arts, but it was the big institution, so perhaps not enough attention to this smaller scale stuff that takes place.
Yeah, I'd agree with me actually, and sort of nicked what I was about to say around the DNA, because I think the culture of the arts is the DNA of a place, and that's what makes us quite unique. And actually, from an investment point of view, that's what also makes us quite attractive, because without that, it becomes quite a bland proposition, which is quite similar anywhere else. You can go. I think the challenge, and it's evident, is actually that smaller, developing creative arts, we still haven't facilitated it going. And that's evident, because we've actually, while you've got the rep, the Hippodrome, you've got all of these institutions which are trying to do that outreach work, but I agree with you, it's still a long way to go, but I think there's a willingness from that. But it's how do you bring that smaller player, and some of them do some quite interesting things themselves, when I actually think the city should just move out of the way in some cases, because it's often trying to help them make them worse. But actually, in some of the local centres, you can see that really, really coming across. One of the things we've tried to do in Smithfield, next to Digbeth, as part of our agreement with land leases, they are required to give space and create an environment where some of that smaller creative arts culture can be caught, because that's what's going to make places like Smithfield vibrant. It's not going to be the corporates. I mean, as much as people might like shopping are boring, but it's the same as any other shopping centre you can go to. But actually, it's the interest of Digbeth, and it's that interest that actually makes that quite a unique place.
Lisa, what is the City Council finds this much more difficult these days, doesn't it? You talked about the impact of shrinking budgets. Nowhere is that clear as in support for the arts.
I think again it comes back to your point about the support for the corporate versus supporting and facilitating the thriving. And in many ways, the journey we started in the 90s of trying to invest and support the Hippodrome, Birmingham Royal Ballet. That actually now is all that we're tied into that rather than actually evolving. So we have a young, diverse population, and actually we're not facilitating or supporting the creativity of that population. And I grew up in this city. I hadn't gone to a theatre until I think I was 25, 30. My idea of culture was a blues party in Handsworth and Pete the Feet in Moseley. I think what's really important is, though, that we actually capture those different types of things. So, you go to Shard End Community Centre, and every week there's a fantastic tea dance. And you sit and you talk to those women, and there's a woman there who built the first self-built house in Chelsea Wood. And the immense pride she's got in that. So when we talk about pride, we talk about culture, we forget what's actually already happening, because the city is made up of a whole series of different communities and different interests. And what I think, one of the things that I always remember was a really fantastic thing. We did some artwork once where it was on the number 11 bus, and it was stories from the number 11, and it was just showing different communities and what they'd contributed to the culture of our city. And I think that narrative of different creativity, different communities is something that we need to look at. And again, facilitating the supportive space for startups. BCU is churning out thousands of really good creative people who haven't got anywhere to set up in our city. We have to find better ways. In Tyseley, in East Birmingham, We've got empty warehouses. You know, we need to find ways of actually facilitating that through. And there is investors. Yeah. There is the investment there. And what we've got to stop doing is looking to structures that seem to involve men having to wear dicky bows and going through formal boards like the LEP and actually finding a way where we actually just let go and say, let it happen.
I was just going to add, I think it's also really important to say that whilst I don't think, you know, I massively advocate a culture of scarcity where everybody does everything in a DIY way, because that's great if it's by choice, but often you're forced to do that, and it can be quite exhausting over a long period of time. I think it's really important to know that, I guess, when you're far away from what actually does happen in communities, you forget that, you know, communities are really, really frugal. They know how to do so much with so little, and even something as that when you walk into the hub, it looks like it's beautiful. Where what I've co-founded looks like a beautiful, high quality. It's an award-winning space for design. The quote for fitting out this old warehouse was the cheapest quote we had was £450,000. We had 90. And we had £90,000. We paid for everything that you legally have to pay for. And then we used, like M&E, for example, you know, and then we used local CNC cutters, we used we worked together as communities to set that space up and made a 7,000 square foot space look like the equivalent of WeWork with some energy. What I'm not saying is that's what everybody needs to do. You need to well capitalise projects. But what I'm trying to say is that there are empty warehouses, there are spaces that can be meanwhile. We need to trust people much more. If I didn't choose a foreign landlord in Digbeth 5 years ago because I couldn't find any of these meanwhile spaces or community asset transfer at that time, I would have put another £500,000 back into the local economy instead of it going straight into the pocket of someone who lives in Abu Dhabi. And I'm not saying that that's all wrong, and I'm not here to create a fight over that, but there is a way for us to just be much more creative, you know, with spaces that are sitting empty, with trusting that communities do know what they're doing, and can organise around that. And if we could do some of that, that would help us over the next few years, whilst it appears like there isn't enough money for arts and culture.
Jez Collins, whose question that was, do you want to come in on this?
I will. I think I agree with that. I think culture is set to place, but I think it goes to the heart of this question. Goes to the heart of things.
Thank you very much. Now, I've got a question from Richard Dixon of Business in the Community, which is about how could we better make sure that the benefits of regeneration and development were shared more widely, more inclusively. I want to put a particular spin on that, because in this city there is always a debate about why are you focusing on the city centre and ignoring the suburbs and the inner areas that surround the city centre. Waheed, what's your take on that? I mean, it's almost inevitable, really, isn't it?
It is, but I suppose it's easier to see what's happening in the city centre when it's a smaller, concentrated part of the city. If you think when you go to the north of the city, whether it's the Advanced Manufacturing Hub, which is the largest regional employment site we created in the city, and actually are delivering substantially on, whether you think it's Icknield Port, whether it's Sutton Coalfield around the urban extension, or Peddymore, or south of the city, where you refer to look at the Life Sciences campus, Longbridge. Actually, there's quite a lot of activity happening across the city. The issue is it's a big city. The areas that I think we've not cracked for a number of reasons, but one of the biggies is around local centres and our local shopping centres, and they're the hearts of our communities. And there has not been much investment at all in those for a number of years. Part of the challenge with that is most of our investment comes from national policy, and there's been a real shift in, and I'm not getting into party politics here, but there has been a real shift in government policy about accelerating growth and looking at inclusive growth. And as a consequence, much of the investment that we could have secured into put into local centres has not existed. And as a city, one of the things we've been starting to look at more recently is about how do we use our land assets to help bring some of that forward. I'm probably going back to the point about the entrepreneur culture that does exist. So I think the local centres have suffered, and I think we recognise that, but I think there's still a lot of other activity happening across the city, which I think is not always that visible.
Deborah, you're actually at the moment leading an initiative on local centres, aren't you?
We are. So with Waheed and our colleagues, we've identified a number of town centres and high streets to repurpose. But I would like to talk about the power of creating growth corridors as a way of spreading kind of wealth and development. So I'm responsible through Transport for West Midlands for public transport, for extending the metro, and I'm absolutely clear that we should use those metro extensions and bus sprint routes as a way of taking the benefits of growth from one area to another, but doing it in an inclusive way. So we're developing a concept called Inclusive Growth Corridors. Waheed is leading the East Birmingham to North Solihull growth corridor. There'll be a metro extension, but the way in which we capture the value of that is going to be really, really important. So we need to spread the benefits all along that route through some really interesting and challenging and segregated communities to make sure that those people benefit from that investment that we're going to see along that route. And there are 7 different growth corridors that we're developing at the moment. And inclusive growth has got to be the way in which we do it. You know, and what I say to the Mayor and other members of the Combined Authority, if the residents of this region can't touch, taste and feel the benefits of the growth that we're seeing, then we've failed. And it's really important we keep that at the heart of everything that we do. So inclusive growth can't just be a concept. It's got to be the way in which we deliver growth and do the work that we do.
Lisa, we're sitting here tonight in Moseley, perhaps one of the most vibrant local centres. What does Moseley get right? What can you learn from that we might do elsewhere in the city?
Okay, so I think I probably actually challenge you in terms of the vibrancy of Moseley as a mixed urban centre. It is a beautiful Victorian village. It has some good pubs, good nightlife. It hasn't been able to maintain a retail offer. We've seen a number of very good local businesses go to the wall. Equally, along the 435, we then have Kings Heath High Street, where we have also some of the best independent music scene, Hare and Hounds pub, fantastic visual venue. And again, we have some small independent businesses that are better able to thrive. Again, I think it's actually trying to understand what secures some of those places. So in Moseley, there's a huge sense of identity. There's several festivals. There's a farmer's market. There is money. Let us be clear. There is money in this area. And there is a professional class who invest a lot of time in protecting the interests of their area. And I think, you know, one of the things I found quite interesting, I now represent Kings Heath Bramwood, so I've moved up the 435, and I still have social capital within Kings Heath. And what I noticed recently was I had school crossing patrols. The council made a bit of a mess of school crossing patrols and decided to suspend recruitment to a number of them. And straight away, the first time school crossing patrol was missed on Kings Heath Primary School, I had 170 emails by the Friday evening. Allenscroft, a very white, poorer council estate, had not had a school crossing patrol for 2 months before I actually had one parent actually write to me. And what I think that showed is we have communities where the expectation is almost that these things happen, that actually they will lose services. There isn't hope for change. And we have communities who are very good at articulating their rights and their needs. And again, if we're doing place shaping, we have to reconcile. And I think one of the difficulties we've got to get better at is how we actually reconcile the different voices and actually ensure we intervene at places, not just actually down there, but on the cusp. So I think Moseley is a very unique centre, like Harborne, like others. And it's what I said at the start, it's the people that make it, but don't underestimate, it is the money that makes it.
Alan, what contribution can the developer make to more inclusive?
Development can make a significant, it depends on the type of development, depends where it is, depends on the scale, but there's no doubt that the uplift in value, if we take residential in green fields, it's a nice simple thing to think about. You might have agricultural values at £10,000 an acre, and residential value could easily be 500,000, £750,000 an acre. So to me, it's a nice clean thing that actually there's a huge uplift that communities should benefit from far more than they do. Yeah. When you get into city centres, it is just more complex. There's far more risk. You know, if you're trying to do, if you go back to 1998 when we started Mailbox, it's a huge risk to buy that building and do it, and getting people to finance. They don't want to know. So it's not at that point that you see the returns coming through, but through the Section 106 agreements, there are real benefits that flow through. I'm sure on Paradise the Section 106 payments will be significant. As a developer, I think the thing that we never quite figure out is what exactly happens to it. And also sometimes that if those Section 106, they have to be used for very specific purposes, and if they don't get used, they get lost. And that just seems nuts, really. Once you've committed and that money's gone, it's gone, hasn't it? But there's a big national model for that. It's not easy to change overnight, but there's no doubt that regeneration of areas and urban and suburban should and could contribute more than it does.
Thank you. Could you give us sort of the top two issues of what are the things that the city could be better at doing that would make the impact more inclusive of some of these big developments?
Yeah, I think so. Top two for me would be to look at this value share. That's something that we're working on quite a lot at the moment in terms of what if we're struggling to fund our public services and spaces where people meet. High streets are dying in their current model because people are shopping and meeting and coming together in different ways. I think that this idea that developers can bring in people like us, which has happened to us recently for a short period of time. We were with capital for fitting out a space and say, come and set up your thing there, and thinking that communities don't know that the reason why they're bringing us in is to really help lift the prices of those houses, to make sure that the houses get sold. And recently on a project we've been working on, we looked at the plan for 20 years down the line, and the site that someone was trying to bring us into with a nice £1 million capital fit out was due to be demolished, obviously, as soon as the houses were sold. And so luckily for us, we were aware of this and able to say, look, we know the game here, we are just as valuable to you as you are to us. What does that look like? That's the first start, and I think we're going to need to be more experimental with that in the city, and to really show, I feel a responsibility to show what that civic and commercial hybrid looks like, so that people can believe that community isn't this just, people, although I think this is brilliant, it's just not just like grannies knitting in a leisure centre corner or a town hall corner, which is fantastic, which I think needs to happen and should happen. But it can be many, many different things, and we can find a way to share that value to help fund things that people need in their neighbourhoods, places where people come together. And I'm quite an ambitious person, but right now what I feel just needs to happen is a couple of these experiments, and the future needs to be free to be imagined, grown and shown, and communities need to be trusted for that. And the other thing I just want to say is that I also I know I've been brought on the panel to be a bit of a different voice, and I want to say this one point. I don't think there is a never-ending ceiling to growth, right? Right now, there is an ecological ceiling. We do, whichever side of politics you sit on, there is a real deep and significant issue with climate breakdown. Not that people around the world have not been experiencing it for a long time, but that we're suddenly going to experience it more violently here. And in this point, I just want to hear more conversations about what 21st century, 22nd century economics looks like. And if we're not ready to be bold with what that looks like, we need to at least be able to allow the experiments to happen. I don't think that we can have any conversation about what the future and development looks like without just accepting this. So I would really like to see more creativity around that conversation and more space to imagine what a more holistic future around that ecological ceiling and people thriving. And if you don't know what this could look like, just read Kate Raworth's book. Like, she has set out a principle step by step for 21st century, 22nd century economics. And whether we believe it's coming or not, I do deeply believe that, and I think that it's really important we pay attention to it.
Thank you. Broaden the agenda. Let me look out. You've all sat there very patiently so far. Is there anybody who's burning to ask a question? Yes, could you just introduce yourself? And, Waheed, one of the city's most prominent priorities at the moment is to deal with this issue of air quality, isn't it? Are we doing enough?
No, I don't think we are. And I think there's been an interesting political debate about, I think, as I said, for 9-10 years, we've been really pushing, trying to move the position where we become less reliant on the car and put a lot more investment into public transport, cycles. I don't think we've been bold enough as we should have been in the city. I think now we're in a position that it's no longer about whether you think you should be able to drive into the city centre with your car, but actually it's about the consequences around the health, which is now allowing us to have a different debate. It's unfortunate that we're at this juncture that we're having a different debate for a different reason, when I think we should have been making this decision a lot earlier on. And I think we've still got a long way to go.
Deborah, you're responsible for the transportation of the whole West Midlands. Where does it,
I agree. I agree with Waheed. I don't think we've been bold enough and done enough to get people out of their cars. But my responsibility is to provide an alternative, a viable alternative that provides public transport that's clean and efficient and affordable, and actually takes people to where they want to go. And we have a very bold and ambitious plan of an integrated public transport network, which will take a number of years to achieve. But there are very quick things that we can do to encourage bus franchise operators to switch to electric engines, for example, cleaner engines. I think I know that the Mayor is investing heavily, the Combined Authority is investing heavily in cycle routes. But again, it is about encouraging people to use those cycle routes. And I heard a hideous statistic a few weeks ago that something like 70% of our young people can't ride a bike, and many more don't even own a bike. So whilst we are trying to get people to use cycle, there's a lot more work that we need to do to make that happen. But we're not doing enough quickly enough, so we've got to accelerate that. As a combined authority, no, but I think as a society and a broader community, then I think we need to find proper incentives, meaningful, sustainable incentives to get people out of their car, using public transport more and cycling and walking more.
Well, this is a very good example, isn't it, of much of the subject matter we've been dealing with today inevitably boils down to tensions and conflicts between people, and particularly the city's attempts to, at different times, control the flow of car-borne traffic has actually faltered over very strong public reaction, not least from people who live outside the city, but coming to it for their livelihood. Is that still the case? How do you deal with those tensions? What are the processes that you can manage the tensions between those who live here and those who live outside?
I think we've come to an interesting point in that there is now an absolute mandatory requirement to address the problems of clean air. So we have a clean air zone. I think what is interesting within that is it's probably a decade too late. And that is one of the challenges. And what we're in the process of actually doing is the communities with most to lose are the communities least equipped. So what you actually start to see is there'll be, and they do tend to be, the man in the van, the skip hire businesses. And when you actually look at the economic profile of now what's happening because of the need to shift around air quality, small businesses are going to be really, really affected. And one of my challenges back to the Combined Authority and the Mayor is very much, so actually if you're serious about inclusive growth, if you're serious about economic restructuring, why aren't we actually restructuring and offering transitional support? Because I think it comes back to Immy's point, and it's such a hard one, that climate change and the need for us to take action is now. You know, there is no wait. And also, if you want to actually hear the voices of our young people, there was 1,000 of them in Victoria Square at the last school strike, and it was the most diverse population I'd seen in Victoria Square in a long time. We cannot continue to pretend the model of growth is viable. The reconciliation for me comes back to when heat or eat is a daily dilemma. We can't actually say that what we are going to do to address climate change is going to make people's lives worse. So it comes back to we have to find ways, and investment needs to be put to actually reconcile that demand for growth, prosperity, with the demand for inclusivity and the demand for climate action. And to me, that is our new triple helix. And it has to be, how do we actually secure the balance through the three?
And as the development industry, how is it responding to the challenge of accelerating climate change and with very visible impact on our lives?
I think there's too much of a lag on development for it to have reacted to things that people are genuinely seeing as an imminent issue rather than something far off in the future. I think development industry will react to regulation. So if U values become significantly higher, if cars become incredibly expensive, then the development industry will respond to that, but probably not to much else.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. I think I'm reading a book at the moment by Carlotta Perez, and she talks about transitions requiring institutional responses, and then gives a whole series of major societal transitions that have had Marshall Plan level transitions, or, you know, when we spent 25% of our GDP buying out slave owners because we were worried about their future business. You know, this is a point at which there is an institutional response needed, that is regulation, that is pricing things properly, that is investing into other parts. You know, I also think there's a big kind of institutional response into terms of some sort of basic or citizens' income to really support the people that are always most affected by transitions, and yet then regulation, a smoking ban style level of things, a disproportionate support for the most marginalised, and for example those with different abilities that need a certain type of transport. You know, there is no like we'll just sort of move around the edges and get there. I think that we're either going to get completely pushed into it, or we can be really proactive about that. And I know people say there isn't the money for these sorts of things, but those sorts of big Marshall Plan style, or, you know, using 25% of our GDP when slave abolition was apparently happening. These were just choices that we made not because it was we were massively philanthropic, but just because we saw the future risk. So it's now time to price the future risk and have a big response to a period of time that isn't just to do with transport and clean air. It is a period of time that is massively about transition from jobs and skills to AI, to the future of what jobs will look like, where value comes from, what clean air looks like, how we'll move around. We're on the precipice, and we are 10, 20 years too late of a big transition. And I think if you read Carlotta Perez's stuff, it's quite interesting because she talks very much about 30 to 40 years for a transition to happen. The problem is we haven't yet got whatever our Marshall Plan is, and we need that.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Back through the range. Back us through to the Grange. As an outsider, Michael, not living in Birmingham, although heavily involved as a non-exec for Taylor Grange, two comments really. First of all, I think you've been very harsh about the reputation of Birmingham. I speak to a lot of investors, both in the UK, I live across London and Manchester, but also internationally, and believe you me, people want to invest in the city, and people are very keen to invest. And I think there is a tendency, perhaps there's a legacy, historical issue there with people within Birmingham having a bit of a downer on the city. But trust me, Birmingham is very much open for investment and very attractive to the world. Recently at MIPIM, that was very much, which is a property conference, that was very much the message. So that's the first thing I'd like to share. Secondly, Deborah, Immy and Lisa have talked about this inclusive growth and shared value, which really resonates for me personally. And without it, we can't make place. The developer community is very guilty of this, as I have been in the past, and I think local authorities are also guilty of this, that we think we've made these big shiny buildings and we've created lots of jobs, which, don't get me wrong, is absolutely vital. But we then sort of look at that and think, job done, move on to the next. But we've left the community behind because there's no community engagement in those big shiny buildings with great public realm, etc. And a very practical example of what I think, Immy, you were just talking about, with shared value and inclusive growth, is what we've started to call community fraction. I know it's just another phrase, but it's every development that is vital to the continuity of Birmingham has to have some fraction of community involvement in it. And an example of that, I think, Immy, you were just talking about old buildings being used for community purposes. I'd like to see every regeneration in Birmingham having a fraction of community in there. And given, I'll go talk to you on a granular level, a 125-year lease of 15,000 square feet given over to some community action group. One example is a small charity that is teaching kids to ride bikes. You mentioned that earlier, Deborah. Another example we're looking at is a kitchen to help young people cook. And I think fantastic examples. But Waheed, we can only do it if the developments are viable and there's some intervention from the local authority which allows us to do it by lowering Section 106 and effectively replacing a small element of the Section 106. Alan mentioned it earlier, where does the Section 106 go? Well, that's another debate. But actually you can probably see, very visibly, demonstrably see how an element of that can go on to those types of giveaways to the local community. So instead of having a £2 million Section 106, let's reduce it to 1.5. Let's put demonstrably that £500,000 into that 15,000 square feet facility. Let's hand it over. And at Taylor Grange, small plug, apologies, but we are trying to do that. And I'm inspired by what you were saying, Immy, earlier. And perhaps we can have a separate conversation about how you might be able to consult with us and get that type of community involvement going. And if we have Waheed's support, then we'll make it happen.
Thanks for that. So you can see the deal making in progress. Of course, Alan also mentioned in his contribution earlier on something much more radical, which is a much bigger share of development going to the local community. And this is not sort of something we haven't actually had in our history. Yeah. Until 1961, actually, the development game was not shared with the owner of the land. It was seen to be captured by the community. We changed the law then to actually give the landowner a bigger entitlement. And it affects both the viability of what can be done, but also who benefits. And that's clearest when you're talking about greenbelt agricultural land, which is an enormous gain, but actually even in city redevelopments, it can play a part. So that might be something which we might reflect on into the future. I'm going to thank you very much for those contributions. I'm going to just look around, see if there are any other questions. Les?
Yes, on behalf of the Cambridge Library Trust, I'd like to turn to the panel for advice. Oh, thank you. Some advice from the panel, please. We're not just about fixing the holes in the roof and getting it rewired and so forth. This all has to be to a purpose. And our purpose is to use this building as an inspiration to young people to engage in studies and learning and discussions about civic management, how we govern our cities. And I think it would be helpful if you could perhaps endorse our ambition in that regard, and maybe also give us some tips as to the things we might do, how we might go about it.
Right.
Right. So I'd really like to talk to you about that, because we're about to create a youth combined authority to do exactly to help young people understand the role they play in the civic stewardship, management and leadership of not just the city but the region as well. And I think being able to host a provocative session around that here would be absolutely phenomenal. So, and I think that would be really impactful.
Lisa, do you want to come in on this subject?
Um,
Can you offer Les some advice?
Well, Les and I talk about this all the time, and Les, I think, is possibly being politer than I. We do actually need millions to improve the physical fabric of this building. So if we have got anyone who's been spurned in love and has millions in the bank that they may want to invest...
Can you come to me after as well, please?
There are trustees in the audience who will gratefully take your money. I think, again, it's about creating space. And, you know, this is a great location. We're on the edge of Borsall Heath, which has some of our most deprived communities. We're on the edge of Moseley, that has some of our most affluent. So this is at the juxtaposition of a whole range of different communities. So symbolically, it is in a good geographical location. And I think at times what we do is we underestimate young people. I was invited into a conference call last weekend of the climate strikers. And the level of debate and maturity of a group of young people ranging from 14 through to 17 was quite amazing. And what I loved was, one, being very clear that although I was a Labour politician, and oh, by the way, you are my mother, you know, we're not having Labour taking this over. But what was very clear was their view about what this city needed to do. And if we are going to have a youth parliament, if we are going to use this space effectively, let's not just have it as one of those things where people come together and nice things happen. Actually, truly give young people a say and actually let them make the policy and shape the policy, because they are going to be the people who are going to occupy this space when we have gone. And we actually owe it to them, because at the moment we're not leaving them with a very resilient future.
Yeah, I would say a practical suggestion I would have is have, you know, one weekend a month, which is a takeover by a different group in the city. Could be decolonial historians, young people, artists, poets, young people organising around climate strike, around transport, whatever they want. The combined authority can put £1,000 towards each one of those takeovers, so young people have some agency. You guys can just step back and make sure that the place isn't set on fire or something. And that's not because young people set things on fire, but because if I'm left unattended, things, you know, sometimes go quite wrong in my building. So, you know, just do the bare minimum to be invisible and welcome people in and let them say what they want to say over 12 weekends in a year, and just watch the relationship between a place, space, possibility, a bit of resource, a bit of agency, a bit of space, and just watch what happens. But you have to really trust that, you know, the only rules you need to have is leave the space as you found it, or better, and here's a bit of money, and all we're going to do is just step back and make sure, you know, the doors are open and the tech works for you. I think that's one of the quickest things you can do, just to start making your building work. And people will come to you. If you do it as an open call, people will submit. They'll just say, yeah, I'm here for this. I've already got an idea for a weekend I'd do. So, yeah, I'm in, if Deborah's in.
The interesting thing about these, the debate about bringing young people together, it's actually back in 1997, in this very building, we established the beginnings of a young person's parliament for Birmingham. So these things come, but actually they sometimes fade away. And that's not necessarily something we should beat ourselves up about, because actually, but we should be proud that actually we do have a history of trying these things out. We just need to get better at rooting them.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, please.
I think it's not just about making it about the building. Because what I found quite interesting when you said was about this is about the leadership, it's about the governance, and I think it's great in me that they come and use the space. But if they've used the space and gone and not any the wiser, then I don't think you've achieved. Because there's lots of places in the city they could use the space. I think it's how do you grasp that opportunity when they are take over the space, that what this building is about and what this symbolises actually is passed on. So whether you take opportunities for giving them the freedom of that space, but capturing that moment and showing it. And I think that's what's lost. I mean, I've been to this building, I love this building, but then that's probably because I know more about the history. But there's many people, even on the edge of this, in the communities around here, who have no understanding other than they think it's an old building that may be interesting, but the history that sits behind it. So you've got to try to capture that and get that across, which I think is what's the game changer.
I'd ask the question what the civic gospel means in the 21st, 22nd century. What do we think we can take from the past, contextualise it to what we know today and what that looks like for the future? And people will just come at you with that, because we're talking, I say we, I just mean lots of people are talking about that. Artists are doing this. If you go to spoken word nights and you listen to what they're talking about, this conversation exists, so you could almost set a brief that is quite expansive around what Waheed said and then just let people do it, and you'll be amazed at what comes. And I think that's the little bit I talked about before about dreams. You need to give the space for people to dream what this means in the future, what all of the history and legacy of here and its challenges can mean for the future of the city.
Well, because one possibility we might add in is actually further cooperation between Lunar Society and the Chamberlain Highbury Trust, and Jackie's here to perhaps carry that forward. Now, other questions? Yes, please. Oh my goodness, too many. Yes, go on.
Hello, thank you. I'm Naomi Fisher. I'm an architect in this city, and I do a lot of making space in my day job, but actually I think most of what I do is facilitating placemaking, and I think there's a big difference between shaping space and Alan talks of good urban design principles that should be carried through. But actually it's out of work that I do much more placemaking, because I think placemaking is a verb rather than a noun, as in place. And it's about people and living things, and I think that's the difference. Buildings and infrastructure and man-made things do make space, but we've got to facilitate that placemaking. I think in terms of our city and the legacy, sometimes I think there is a bit too much of an obsession with buildings, and I'm an architect and I'm saying that, and man-made infrastructure. And yet I think kind of the legacy of Chamberlain and Cadbury is much more to do with uniting public health and planning. And I think we've forgotten that. You know, in the times of Chamberlain, there was massive squalor and deprivation in the city. And the way infrastructure was put into place, and parks and infrastructure and, you know, the tram system that followed as well. And then with Cadbury as well, taking people out of, you know, the industrial city centre and giving them space and in order to placemaking to happen through not just people as living things, but the living environment around us. And I think in terms of equality and social inclusion, much of my work is in very deprived communities, and they feel out of place in places that, you know, we might find in the architectural magazines in Birmingham are lauded as, you know, really successful developments. They wouldn't go there. In the same way that I feel out of place in some parts of Birmingham, including on the Ray Valley cycle route for 4 months of the year when I'm going home, because as a woman, I suddenly don't feel I can go there, and I'd rather risk getting killed on the Pershore Road because of social exclusion, because of, you know, that kind of fear. But there's a lot of people in the city who are socially excluded from what we consider as what a great space, what a great place. And I think that's where we've got to really understand our communities, and, you know, engaging with communities is what is at the base of what I do in my architectural profession, but very much in my personal life too, in terms of instigating initiatives. So how are we respecting the legacy of Cadbury and Chamberlain as forefathers to this city in things other than just the built infrastructure?
Thank you. Now, what I'm going to do, because it's clearly there's quite a lot of people want to come in and a limited amount of time, I'm just going to, rather than asking the panel to respond to that very rich contribution, just to pick up some other comments and questions, and then we'll give the panel a chance to sort of rage across them. Yes, please.
And also representing the UK Green Building Council, and we had an event yesterday on climate resilience, and actually piggybacking on the back of that comment, we were talking about natural infrastructure and how it solves so many issues, to do with air quality and things like that. And actually, we are one of the, I think there's only a few global biophilic cities. So how are we really celebrating that and pushing that as part of our brand going forward?
Thank you very much. Was a quick, just really with a question. Oh, yes, please. Yes, please.
The Commonwealth is a place.
Can you just introduce yourself and then before?
Oh, okay. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman. Among other things, I'm an honorary research fellow in history at the University of Birmingham, Chamberlain's University. So the Commonwealth is a place. In 2022, what we'll be doing is bringing one place into another, if it isn't already there. The Commonwealth used to have another name, the Empire. And in fact, that's highly relevant to Joseph Chamberlain. You mentioned that you're going to encourage young people to talk about civic matters. Well, he was not only mayor of Birmingham, he was, for almost a decade, the colonial secretary. What then is the relationship between this city and the colonies, or colonized places? I think we need to think about this history, especially over the next 3 years, as we move towards bringing the colonies to the city and celebrating this idea of the Commonwealth, the wealth that's held in common. I don't think this wealth is held in common, and I'm worried about the way in which we might be sleepwalking into celebrating empire.
Thank you. Anybody else want to join in this round of questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. I am Catherine O'Donnell. I work with Berwick Partners, but predominantly I work in the built environment. So it seems a shame to move away after such a rich cultural question. But it was raised earlier that local communities feel left out of housing initiatives and the like that come into their space, but most of these come from central government. They will happen, or they have to happen in some way. So how, as a local community, can we leverage these opportunities, both from a developer perspective, but also from the local inhabitants or the local government? How do we get them involved in reclaiming their autonomy on the housing and the developments that are going to happen? How do we include everyone but give them autonomy on something that must happen to be in line with, I suppose, central government's plans?
Okay, thank you very much. So I've got 4 issues there. A wider perspective on placemaking and a challenge to look back at a legacy there. Concern about natural infrastructure, whether that's something that we might promote more strongly as part of Birmingham's current offer. The, again, legacy of empire and how that's dealt with and how the city faces up to that in the context of the Commonwealth Games. And then finally, how can local communities effect some leverage on big investment schemes to their benefit? So, moving across the panel, I'm going to start with Waheed.
Okay, and if I can take, I'm going to try to remember all of those points. I'll start with the last verse, because it's easier for me to remember. I think with the housing initiatives, I think some of the issues that you have with some of these initiatives is actually, and if you think of sort of like the urban extensions that we've got in Sutton Coldfield, the real challenge and the resilience of the communities was actually the existing infrastructure that was there wasn't sufficient to cope with the population, and then you're bringing more people in there, and how do you then cope with it? So one thing we were very clear about was actually we would have one large single urban extension that could fund the infrastructure, i.e. primary schools, secondary schools, contributions to health, to enable that place. But also then making sure that either you've got capacity for self-build, you've got capacity for local people to be not just employed, but accessing that labour market. And that's, from a city perspective, how we've tried to manage that is to do that in the procurement process alongside the planning. The challenge we have is we are still governed by a national set of regulations. So as much as we may have a will, you can push so far, but then actually if you push so far, people can take a different route to go down, which then lose all your influence. So it's always trying to get that right balance. In terms of the Commonwealth Games, I think it's clearly an opportunity. I think you've made some interesting points, and it's also some quite challenges. I think one of the aspirations from the Games was also recognising that we've got such a diverse population that actually how do we celebrate some of that and then try to grasp some of those legacy opportunities. I really would agree about the natural infrastructure. I mean, it's one of the big things that I think we've really not grasped at all in the city. But you also need scale to actually make sure that you can really make that impact and prove it. And I think one of the areas we're looking to pilot that around is the River Ray and Smithfield, which we've been very keen to grasp. And we've been working with the Green Building Council. I can't remember the first point, I'm sorry.
Legacy of Chamberlain and Calvary in terms of health and reuniting public health and planning.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly one of the, if you look, one of the things we've tried to be really clear about is that infrastructure, whether that's around High Speed 2, whether that's around how we build on the point Deborah made about the metro, but looking at health as part of that infrastructure. The bits in terms of the architecture will be what it be, but I think we still see quite the public role and the value is very much around that infrastructure piece. So I think it's important, but
I think it's promoting walking and cycling as well in communities, not just in, and actually making communities mixed communities of employment and living, rather than just connecting places of retail to places of employment to places of...
I'd agree with you. I wouldn't disagree.
Deborah, you don't have to answer all four of these.
But the points you raise are really important, and we are repurposing high streets, some of our high streets and town centres at the moment. We're just doing 5 across the region to test. And one of the really important points around repurposing the high streets is to deliver services that people actually want and will use. And I had to just stop a conversation last week because we were going off into the realms of fancy, and nobody had thought that the starting point had to be to ask the residents in those places what they wanted. So we've kind of rode back now, and we're kind of doing it in the right way. And Immy, I want to talk to you about helping us do that. But we've got to ask people, what do they want to use? Yeah, now I kind of think I'm down with the kids, but actually I'm not. So we are creating places that our young people will be using hopefully for many years. And if we don't engage them and ask them what they want and how they want to live and use retail and leisure, we're going to be creating stuff that's not going to stick. So, and I think the answer to our high streets is to repurpose them in a completely different way. And I'm absolutely fixated about having pop-ups for health screening facilities, because there are so many women in this city that don't access health screening, and I think it's an absolute disgrace. And we need to understand why not. Is it about accessibility or cultural issues? And I think repurposing some of our high streets to enable them to do that is a really positive thing. I will try and address the stuff about the Commonwealth, because I think it's a really important point. And I don't think we can afford to sleepwalk into celebrating the empire, but we do have to confront it. And I don't think we can sweep it under the carpet and put on the most amazing Commonwealth Games without addressing that. And I think the role of historians like yourself and others in the room need to play a really important part in that. But I do think, again, that we need to understand what the Commonwealth means in the modern context, and the fact that we have one of the most uber diverse communities outside London, and the Commonwealth is represented in this place. So we need to celebrate that in a really positive way. But we can't ignore the history. And I do think there's almost a kind of confronting of that history, or not an acceptance of that history, but an acknowledgement of that history, and a commitment that our celebration of the Commonwealth Games will be something completely different.
Thank you. Immy, which of those issues do you want?
I'm going to go for 2. It's a bit unfair for me to go for Nathaniel's because we're friends and we share many of the same opinions, but I'm going to go for it. I think that Birmingham, talks about a unique Commonwealth Games, and I'm a massive sports fan, but I'm really very conflicted on the Commonwealth Games because I feel like the conversation around many of the things that Nathaniel's talked about will be like a counter-culture protest type group that people try to sweep under the carpet. And what I think just needs to happen is that we need to our USP needs to be that we confront the reality of what the empire was in all its guises, right? Like, and some of those are really terrible. Birmingham Airport was where the last set of Windrush deportations happened. You know, Birmingham quietly, bar 50 of us shouting outside New Street, quietly let that happen. Many of those were minor crimes. These were the same citizens that we also, want to celebrate. So I think the best thing, Commonwealth citizens. So I just think, like, let's just stop trying to skirt around it and make part of what makes Birmingham so incredible is to actually confront that and say we are in 2019 and say we've got historians and artists who can tell us and communities who can tell us about what that meant for them and what it still means for them, and we can have the games and we can have infrastructure investment and we can join this all up and not leave it to the same few people to have to shout on behalf of many people, because the impact to this day of it not being Commonwealth is that 2 months ago Commonwealth citizens of this country were deported from our airport over minor crimes, right? That is the reality of it. So I just don't have any two ways about this. I think we should make ourselves unique by confronting things that other cities, other places, other parts of the UK just won't do. And let's not make it counterculture. Let's not make it this small thing you try and sweep. Let's just say, this is who we are, and we can be all of these conflicted realities and celebrate it in one go. You can hear from just how Nathaniel articulates himself. It is not just angry people looking to burn down anything that happens in the Commonwealth. These are smart, articulate, incredible people who have got stories as well as deep history, and let's just bring it to the fore and let's say this is part of that story. And the other thing is, I think on communities and development, I think there are so many tools out there now that we just need to democratise more. I mean, some of the incredible movements in London against some quite terrible developments were led by communities having access to some great architects and some great planners and some people who could show a vision of what they wanted, and then they got out and fought for it. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to show what we think an alternative can be by engaging a range of different people. I think we need to find ways to actually, developers should arm communities with some of those resources and say, come on then, tell us what it looks like for you, right? And bring that into reality with tech and VR and visualizations and let the community tell the developer what they're looking for. It's minor money to a developer, but what happens in terms of the relationship between the two can really grow. The other thing I would say, though, is it's not just about community engagement. Like, it has to be about ownership. There has to be some of that value shared. You have to be able to give some, a CLT or holding the land in some sort of perpetuity for the future. We need to also share value and ownership, not just, hey, let us know what you think for a short period of time.
Thanks, Immy. Alan?
I feel a little bit sad because I feel like I was here 30 years ago. Having the same discussions. I feel literally 30 years ago I came here to start Brindley Place, and we went into Ladywood many times, spoke to people, took lots and lots of questions, tried to find out what we could do. We worked with the schools, we worked with artists, we did our very best, and we did okay. In some ways we did okay, but we could have done much more. And I think the way I've heard, particularly Immy, talk about, democratise more. They're phrases, but to be given money from the city council or the regional authority, it's difficult. You need to create some kind of real life structures that means you can take £10,000 and they can give it to you. And it's those that have always been missing. Yes, there was a percentage for art for many years. How long did that go on for, Les? 10 years? So from every development, a percentage was attributed to art, but it just ended up being statues and not that well done. In a lot of cases, some of it was well done, others wasn't. So I think I come back to, I am driven to do things. So when I listen to this, I get incredibly sad and frustrated because there's no obvious tool. There's not even a not obvious tool to do it. But to make all these things happen, that people around here, genuinely you can sense that how much they want it, there needs to be some structure and some money.
Lisa.
I think certainly the architects of Brindley Place and our city really shouldn't beat themselves up and feel that there was something wrong, because again, as somebody who made a decision to stay in this city, bring my children up in this city, what was achieved at that time was absolutely fantastic. And, you know, I've done some collective memory work, and Albert Ball was one of those that I talked through, and it was a period where no one would invest in Birmingham. So things, the broader social fabric, some of that had to go to the wall because actually there was a need to shape a different identity. I think the issue now is we have that identity. We have, in a way, a Birmingham brand, and we're not seizing and sweating the asset we have to connect it to the communities. And that's what I think is why we have to look for a different city model. I'm co-founder of a new consortium co-op, Places in Common, and our sort of whole reason for being is reimagining the city as actually understanding that the land is something we hold in common, that the air is something we hold in common. And if you start to actually think, as citizens, we have rights, we have responsibilities, then actually you can start to make some of those, have those difficult conversations. And we referenced housing earlier. I think one of the difficulties for Birmingham is we've gone down a cul-de-sac on how we look at housing, and we talk to council tenants. Well, actually, they're tenants with rights, but actually the land that council housing is on is our citizens' land. It belongs to all of us, and all the citizens of our city, whether they live in Balsall Heath or Druids Heath, should have a say in a development, not just the 200 tenants who happen to be occupying that land during a tenancy. And I think that is where we have to rethink, and we have to think about how we shape the communities and actually have the wealth and the opportunity in common, because at the moment our approaches are holding things in very much in the status quo. Picking up quickly on the Commonwealth issue, totally agree with you. It was an issue I loudly brought up at the time. I have concerns about the costs of the Commonwealth Games at a point where we're losing community facilities and we're closing facilities in the very communities who are part of our Commonwealth. So one of the big things for me is the big take would be to actually have the run-up to the Commonwealth Games as being that conversation we need to have of what does it mean to be a diverse city? How is it that where we have been actually has got us to where we are, and what do we need to shape differently? To me, that was the huge bonus. It hasn't been something that was necessarily seen by the current Chief Exec as the way forward, but it has to be built on, because otherwise, you're right, we run this huge risk and we don't connect it to the communities. And then my final point on the connecting communities, I won't go into parks and the importance of children parks if we have those conversations, but our green space is fantastic in this city. It connects whole communities, and actually seeing it as part of our infrastructure instead of just a park, a field, or putting a no ball game sign up so a young person doesn't even feel part of it. Actually looking again at the green map of our city and seeing how it connects through, you can actually shift and do a modal shift very easily by using that green asset we already hold dear.
Good. That natural capital issue, good final word there on that. Now, question time always used to end with a sort of slightly different type of question, and so we're going to resurrect that tradition. Now, I'm going to ask each member of the panel, because this is about place, for a favourite place, but there's one restriction. You cannot all outbid each other for how good a champion you are in Birmingham. So it has to be a place other than this city. Waheed.
Thanks. So my favourite place, got so many, and this is my challenge if I'm honest with you. One of my favourite places is Madrid. That's around the vibrancy in the squares, Lyon, Chicago. I could probably go on, but it's about the place and the vibrancy of those places, public spaces, which makes them so attractive.
Thank you. Deborah.
Agra and the Taj Mahal, because I have never experienced such a visceral, physical response to something of such beauty.
Oakland, California, the home of the resistance, civil rights movement, a place that's being absolutely decimated at the moment at the expansion of San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and communities are fighting back like hard, and it is inspirational. It's my favourite place.
Thank you.
I love beautiful, small, news streets.
Great.
Okay.
Lisa?
I love many cities, but possibly my current favourite place is, I have a narrowboat and I moor it at Kingswood, and I absolutely love when I get to sit on my narrowboat and I'm within the heart of this region, but equally I know that network connects me back to my city and the broader legacy of where we've come from.
Great, you take those 5 answers, really very rich offer in terms of what is it, what we mean by place, and how does one place different from another. I'm going to draw us to a close now. Thank you all for coming. I hope this, if you've enjoyed tonight, then come and join us in the Lunar Society, because what we seek to do is to encourage good-tempered debate. We want to focus on things changing, on action, so it's not just about debate, it's actually about trying to move things forward, and we're not shy of causing a bit of controversy, and I think we've seen a little of that very, very, very expertly delivered by our panel tonight. So can I ask you to thank our 5 speakers who've done a great job for us. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this podcast and are interested in joining the Lunar Society, then please visit our website www.lunarsociety.org.uk, or alternatively email us at info@lunarsociety.org.uk. You can also call us on 01564 821582.